This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's the place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. So welcome aboard, folks. This is Dr. Charles Parker. We're here again for Core Brain Journal one more time, and we've got a very interesting author to interview regarding a book where she's going to talk predominantly about one book, but she has two books out, which I'll tell you about in a second. And her name is Kayt Sukel. Welcome, Kayt. Thank you for coming on board.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So the real reason that I wanted Kayt to come on board and was so pleased that she accepted is because she's talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, to all the listeners here at Core Brain Journal, and that is risking change in a world that remains in some respects stuck. Where do we actually experience the evolution? How do we do it? How can we do it more effectively? And what's the meat and bones of risk takers? What do they do? I mean, if you think about it, Kayt, you tell me, isn't writing risk taking?
It is, I think. A lot of people think it's crazy. I'm a freelance writer, so, I have a bunch of clients, but I know I don't have a regular paycheck. I'm not quite sure what my next story is going to be. And now I have benefits through my husband, and I'll tell you, for some people, that seems crazy. I need to get myself a nice 9 to 5, go into an office, some kitten heels, or else, I'm really risking my family and my well-being.
There is a little bit to it. I'm going to tell our listeners a little bit about you. So Kayt lives in Houston, Texas, and the two books that I've been alluding to are The Art of Risk, The New Science of Courage, Caution, and Chance, which is one of the reasons we're talking. And get this is Your Brain on Sex, the science behind the search for love. I can imagine some people will be interested in reading that book as well, and both of those will be linked on the show notes. Well, how did you come to focus on the risk book itself? What drove you down that path? What was going on in your life?
Well, I've always been called a risk taker. It's one of the ways that people described me. And certainly when I was younger, I had a very unconventional path. Dropped out of high school to go to college. I didn't finish my PhD twice. I went to go live in Europe for a number of years. I had a baby and started traveling around, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East with him strapped to my back. And, instead of staying home and joining a mommy and me class. But then I hit 40 and I lost my mojo. I was having what I called a midlife crisis in reverse. And I really felt like I had lost something very important. And so I wanted to understand what risk was, especially from a neuroscientific background and a psychological background. But then also, if it was that key to my past success, how I could get it back without risking too much. Because certainly now I had a mortgage, a child to take care of. I didn't want to lose my shirt in the process. And that's really where it started. And I'll tell you, when I started the book, I wanted to look at the science, but I also wanted to talk to successful risk takers about how they approached risk, how they'd made the calculation and managed it. I really thought I was writing a certain kind of book that was going to kind of be about superheroes and, maybe the occasional criminal or drug addict. But really what I found out was that risk is an everyday decision-making process. And that means it's something that's open to everybody, not just our favorite sports heroes and, poker players and billion-dollar business dealers, but each and every one of us.
Well, you are so much talking our language, I'll tell you that, Kayt. I mean, we haven't met before, but this is right along the theme of where we are because, and it's the reason I think that the Core Brain Journal we enjoy so much. Oh gosh, I can't. Somebody is ringing me. From Florida. That's wild. I've got to turn this thing off. Can you hear that? Can you hear that phone ringing in there?
No, I could not.
Oh, that's good. I mean, my cell phone's hooked up to Skype, and so I could hear it on I had to go turn it off to make sure it happened. Some political groups have gotten my cell phone, so they ring it at the weird time. So I had it on silent, but I'll ask the guy that's producing this to take all this out of it.
Okay.
But anyway, back to it. So the issue was, as we were speaking, I think it's so important because this is what goes on with humanity on Main Street, is that we all have decisions to make. And very often they can be very meaningful decisions if we make them, and very frequently individuals are stuck in the process because of the not being aware of exactly what it takes to make the decision and the consequences of not making it, and dealing with change.
Well, I also think that we tend to make risk a lot scarier than it needs to be. We think that it's this big consuming thing that other people have to deal with. We are just regular people. We live our lives. We're risk averse. We don't like risks. And we don't understand that it is really a decision-making process. It's really part and parcel of every decision you make every single day. Because there's that old line, right? That nothing's certain but death and taxes. But take that one apart. Nobody knows how much they're going to owe Uncle Sam each year. It's a mystery, and you don't know how you're going to die either.
True, yeah.
I mean, so there's really uncertainty everywhere, and that is whether you are deciding to, jump out of a plane, or whether you're deciding to have that third cup of coffee in the morning, even though you know it might give you the jitters later. So I think once we sort of reduce risk to what it is, which is really a simple process, and it's a decision that has an outcome that is uncertain and that may be negative, you start to understand that it's not just danger, there's also a lot of opportunity.
Well, you sound like you must have been getting a PhD in neuroscience. What was your PhD aspiration?
My aspiration was a PhD in neuroscience, but I also was working towards one in computer science as well, because I'm really interested in the way that we interact with engineered systems. But I was in graduate school during the dot-com boom, and I got really interested in working and learning more about how people were interacting with the world. So I left school, and while my mother still wishes I would go back and get my doctorate, I feel like it ended up being a pretty good move for me.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you're on, the way you're speaking, it just sounded so neuroscientific, and the way it rolled off your tongue, because the average person doesn't really quite think about the word neuroscience much in their ordinary conversation.
Well, I think
No, please go
I
ahead.
think what's interesting about neuroscience is it really is becoming more and more important, not only to our health, but by the way that we think about behavior. And I think, even if you don't have a background, it's really important to understand that the brain, if we distill it down to its simplest function, it's in the prediction business. It's trying to figure out what's going to happen next in the world. And it does that so it can help you survive and hopefully ultimately thrive. And that's where risk becomes really interesting, especially as something that helps you learn and build your skills and, work towards long-term goals, because the brain is sort of set up to deal with uncertainty in certain ways. And when you kind of understand those things, the shortcuts it takes, you can use those to your advantage. And I think that was really the fascinating thing. As I said, when I started to write this book, I really thought it was going to be about these superhuman people that managed to do these things. They're genetically different. They're wired different than the rest of us. And I found out that, well, first of all, each and every one of them basically told me some version of, actually, I'm not really a risk taker. Even as they're talking about, uh, enemy incursions into hostile territory or jumping off cliffs with nothing but a parachute. But you find that it really is a simple process. It's just that some people utilize that process in situations that have a little bit more gravity and gunfire than the rest of us.
Well, one of the things that occurred to me in preparing for this conversation was the almost, it's not a dichotomy at all, because the pattern is there in both contextual circumstances. But the one aspect of risk on an individual basis with what one is doing with one's life, and then there is the other business of what one does with one's social engagements, professional life, and peer review. Because it seems to me part of the problem is that a lot of people would like to break out and really have better information regarding neuroscientific approaches to how they can recover from life adversities.
Right.
And others are just stuck in this situation of this is the only way we think about it. We're awash with labels. Yes, I agree that that's problematic, but thinking about it more precisely is going to cause me trouble with my colleagues.
Well, I think what's interesting about neuroscience is how much it's really held up what we've thought about in psychological terms for so many years. I mean, so much of the work that's been done in things like resilience, in behavior, I mean, what we're learning from the brain really backs up the way we've thought about it. New work that shows that prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's kind of right behind your forehead, the most evolved part of the human brain, it's the executive control center, and it lights up whenever we sort of emotionally regulate, when we try to be more self aware. And it can actually sort of dampen down, I don't want to say instinctual, because that's not exactly right, but sort of, we have urges, we have things, we have feelings that we don't have control over what's happening to us. We're victims. And, we can actually see now with neuroscience so often that when we take a step back, we put situations in context. We don't make it all about ourselves, but we see this frontal lobe activation that really fits in with what psychologists have been telling us for years about how to deal with adversity and how to be more resilient. And I think that's wonderful. We're seeing a lot of converging evidence.
It's interesting because it seems that a lot of conversation in terms of personal and societal evolution has to do with just exactly what you're talking about regarding leaving the reptilian brain behind.
Right.
And really using that metacognition in the prefrontal cortex to figure out where you're going to go next in a constructive way.
Well, I think, the truth of the matter is we'll never be able to leave our reptilian brain completely behind. It is something that gives us motivation, pleasure. It regulates so many basic human functions. But, that doesn't mean we have to give into it all the time. And so that kind of regulation, I think it's really interesting because it's not always a matter of saying, no, you can't have these rewards, you can't have these pleasures. But a lot of times it is a matter of, well, you can't have them right now. Or, because if you think about it, if we all were so reward based, we only listen to our reptilian brain all the time, the world would be a pretty inhospitable place. We need some breaks, or the brain system, a break system that will help, sort of not extinguish that, but at least dampen it down a bit. But we also so many things that make us human and beautiful. Art, creativity, good food, good sex, good relationships. Those are all things that are very directly tied back to the reptilian brain. So we don't want to give them all up as well. I mean, I think what it comes down to is you want a brain circuit that has good communication between that frontal lobe brake system and that reptilian brain gas system so that you know when to push ahead and you know when to hold back. And you can make better decisions in doing so. But it does come down to that kind of self-awareness, knowing who you are. And again, like you were saying, we don't want to put labels on things so much anymore. And I think that's a good thing because we're learning that we're all very different. We all approach stress, adversity, emotion in very different ways. But when we're more aware of how we approach those situations and how they can sort of monkey with our decision making, I think we can come out ahead. We can know when to hold back and when to push forward.
Well, that concept of time and context, and timing, I should say timing rather than time, because that's what's missing so often in the way we deal with people, is because we don't think about whether they did it in a correct set of milliseconds, even though we think that way and we react that way to our fellow human beings. How was their timing? We don't really think about it diagnostically or behaviorally as much as I think we should.
Right. I think another interesting thing for me is how often when we talk about risk taking, we think of it as a synonym for impulsive behavior, for sensation seeking behavior. And I think what's been wonderful about adding in some of the neuroscience is that we see that these things are a little bit different. I tell this story about impulsive behavior. My son, when he was 2 or 3 years old, we were in a cafe. He wanted chocolate cake, but I wasn't going to get him any until he finished his dinner. It just so happened the woman next to us at the table ordered herself a piece of chocolate cake. And so he was, a preschooler. He went over and he swiped her cake. And, now this story is hilarious. A 3-year-old grabbing some lady's, chocolate cake, he wanted it. He wanted it badly. He went after it. He was being impulsive. But imagine if he had been 16 years old and done that, or 35. He needed to learn how to regulate and have the tools that even though he wanted it right now, okay, no, he had to eat his dinner first and his vegetables. Maybe he would just have to take no for that night and wait for chocolate cake another day. But that's not risk taking. It's certainly not successful risk taking. And so drawing these kind of lines in the way that we're defining things and talking about things, I think that's been a real benefit of neuroscience, because we see that impulsivity is different from taking smart, seasoned risks as we're approaching a long-term goal.
I like that word seasoned because that encourages me to take you down this next path, and that is the whole evolution of courage in a person's life, and how a person ultimately becomes courageous, when they become courageous, and how they can think about facing change more courageously.
Well, courage is really a fascinating subject, because I think if you took 10 people that you would consider courageous for one reason or another, and ask them why they do what they do or how they did it, they would give you a very different story. There are a lot of things that motivate courageous behavior, and sometimes it's survival based, sometimes it's training. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's people wanting the rush of getting involved in something like that. So I think that's interesting that there are so many different paths that could take us there. But I think that people who have hero type professions, who are courageous on sort of a daily basis and not in sort of specific one-off circumstances, what you see is they are exceedingly trained. They practice and train for every possible medical situation that they might have to encounter. If you think of someone like an EMT, they are trained to work under pressure. They're trained to, deal with natural disasters. And what happens is then when the stress of an actual situation comes on, they can be courageous because they're focused on the task at hand instead of all the things that might be happening in the environment that could be distracting the rest of us. They have a job, they need to get it done, and they're focused. And I think, that says a lot to me, because that means that when you do prepare and you do the hard work and you have this kind of training behind you, it looks really easy to be courageous. It's not always, even with all that stuff going on. But, the brain wants to sort of fall back into habits and stuff when the proverbial stuff hits the fan. And when you have that kind of training, you have all the best habits to fall back on.
I think that's a very interesting point, because then the next thing that occurs to me while you're saying that, because I'm thinking about my own life experiences and the people I've worked with, I think that the family approach to thinking in that regard and to approaching change is an important underwriting factor. What do you think?
I think family is as well. And the other parallel I see are to things like cognitive behavioral therapy. In a sense, it's a matter of training. It's about teaching your mind to consider things in a different way, to approach things that are scary to you or stressful to you in a different way. And if you can train yourself to not immediately go into negative thinking, or to remind yourself when you do go down sort of a more negative path to think more positively, again, you have those kind of best habits to fall back on. But in terms of family, we've seen so much research now that shows that having a strong family builds resilience. That some of the best indicators of resilient children are having, strong, resilient parents, being shown, on a regular basis how to deal with stress in positive ways. And I think that does come through later on.
Well, as a traveling person, you are probably a great role model for your children. How many children do you have?
I have 2 children, a son and a daughter.
So was the son that was on your back when you were in Africa, or how did that work?
Yes, yes. So he is been now to 40 odd countries, and he's a great traveler. He's very adaptive. He loves meeting new people. He loves seeing new things. And it was really, really a wonderful experience for us. My daughter, she's technically my stepdaughter, but I consider her my daughter. I remarried about 3 years ago, but now I'm dragging her along for the ride too. And it's been wonderful to see, especially since she was a bit older coming into this, how she really blossoms in these novel situations too.
How can we construct? This is a difficult question, but it does come to mind, and because I'm so fascinated with how do we actually move the bar forward for the kind of things that we're talking about. How would one actually put together a program or think about a way to evolve the thinking regarding the changes that need to be made in identification and working with underlying brain and body problems regarding the human mind, sort of what we're into here. How would that change take place? How could we orchestrate that?
That is a very difficult question. I think that the way that psychology and neuroscience are informing one another is a great start because we're learning a lot of really important things from the brain science about developmental critical periods and sensitive periods that can be really great times, not only to do I say great times to do damage, like it's a good thing, but not only times when damage can be easily done, but also times to possibly intervene, and really the best time to, with certain types of therapies, perhaps to get involved. I think that, as much as I think mindfulness is becoming an overused word in certain respects, we are learning how important self appraisal and self awareness is. And so helping people take stock and not be ashamed of the way that they approach the world and just saying, you know what? Everybody's actually a little different. There's no normal and abnormal anymore. There's a continuum. And maybe you need a little bit more help in this area, and I need a little bit more help in this area. And I think that's also important. It's not an us versus them anymore. It's just this is the way, whether it's a learning disability or a mental health condition or a stressful period in one's life, understanding how you interact in the world with the world in this particular instance, I think is really helpful to moving towards your long-term goals, and also, working from a therapeutic aspect. We're learning more about genes, and of course it's not as simple as we thought. We thought that there would be a smart gene and a loving gene and a parenting gene, and of course it's much, much more complicated than that. But I do think that what we're learning about these genetic contributions to complex behaviors also gives us some new interesting ways in. So I think, of course it's a work in progress. It's something that there's never going to be one size fits all answer to. But so much of the research is converging, and I think that's very exciting and gives us a good place to at least test new ideas and really think about that self-awareness and self-appraisal.
I think the diversity of reality is the way that change is going to take place. The appreciation of different realities and the complexity of what we're dealing with is going to be the instrument of change. Because I think what we've lived with too long is kind of a dream fantasy situation, sort of a post-Freudian.
Right.
It's an unconscious world, and it's complex, and since it's somewhere lost in the mind, we're just going to have to play guesswork for the rest of our lives, both on a psychopharmacological level and on an interpersonal level. And what you're saying about cognitive behavioral therapy and some of the other activities, it's you're dealing more with the actual reality, the pain, and how to manage the pain, as opposed to what are the, if you will, imaginary things that may have contributed to it.
Right. I mean, we definitely like our categories, and we like things to fit into nice little boxes. But I think when it comes to the mind and mental health, and really just, the way that we perceive and interact with the world, there are just such immense individual differences. And even for conditions that we think of as being very straightforward to a certain extent, depression, or even something like cancer, which has nothing to do with mental health, we're now finding that probably what we thought of as this one type of cancer is actually probably a collection of very rare diseases. Same thing with depression. There are probably multiple subtypes. And as we learn more, it just may mean that, it means that one drug isn't going to fit for everybody, one treatment isn't going to fit for everybody. And it means we have to take a step back, really personalize our approach. And again, that's something that self-awareness and self-appraisal, and if we can help give people the tools to do that, is really going to come back and I believe help people feel better faster and do better faster, whether, no matter, what their particular issues are.
I quite agree with you. That's one of the reasons we're doing Core Brain Journal, because I know in my own life, working professionally, and I've had a variety of training experiences in my 45 years. But when I'm in the chair with a person across the room and I'm not getting it right, and that person isn't making the progress they need to make, when I'm doing my best from the various trainings I've had, then it's time for me to open my mind up and consider other options. And that's one of the reasons we're having these conversations, because there are so many additional options out there. Somewhere in there, other answers will arise if we keep having giving ourselves the permission to take the risk,
right,
accept the change, and really the courage to go ahead and try some different things to see if they work. A lot of peer-reviewed materials, investigations, laboratory results are out there, but not really accepted by mainstream because they just don't fit into groupthink.
Right. Well, I think also, this is another exciting aspect of the brain science. We're finding that, our mind, our behavior really is this unique sum of our genes and our experience. And they come together in some really wild and wonderful ways. And so if we sort of accept from the beginning that we're all just a little bit different, and, those differences, they're very small. In fact, if we think about it from the genetic level, this was a great quote from one of the cultural anthropologists I spoke to. He said, with a lot of these genes, it's just one small gene, and its contribution may be very small, but that one little difference over a lifetime can result in very different lives lived. And I think that's the case when we sum together genes and environment for any mind, for any brain. And it means that sometimes, the status quo or what works for everybody else, it's not going to work for everybody. We gotta open our minds a bit. Totally agree.
So let's take it down the path a little bit further and talk about your other book as well, because it is interesting. It may not be completely neuroscience on the front end, but I'll bet when we talk about it, it's going to be more neuroscience on the back end, and that is, this is your brain on sex.
Sure.
Searching for Love. Could you tell us a little bit about that book?
Well, it's funny. If you think back to the first time you fell in love and those heady, crazy feelings, and just the fact that something like that had the power to change your decision making. And in fact, what? Let's not even talk about you. Let's talk about your best friend. And when they fell in love for the first time, and all of a sudden they stopped returning your phone calls all the time. Maybe they were late for work. All they could talk about was their love. They kind of became sort of tedious. We see really, really profound changes to people's behavior, to their decision making, to their perceptions when they're in love. Why is that? If it just comes down to propagating the species, why do we need such a profound change to happen? And so I kind of wanted to look at what neuroscience would have to say about it. A lot of the, inspiration for the book was actually the birth of my son. I liked kids, but I had never thought of myself as one of those sort of googly-eyed maternal types. And I'll tell you, when I gave birth to my son, I became every mommy, googly-eyed mommy stereotype there was. And I really wanted to understand what had changed. And so it was an examination of a lot of the work that's been done in love, in sex, and attraction, and pair bonding, and just all the ways that this one little thing that we talk about as love can really alter the way that the brain works.
So tell me this, what's the implication for dopamine in this regard? I have to tell you why I'm asking this question. One of my colleagues is Dr. Kenneth Blum, who put together the concept of reward deficiency syndrome.
Yes.
And he's talked a lot about how we chase that dopamine. What was your finding in that regard? Did you agree with that?
I think that there is something to it. Obviously, any behavior is never going to be distilled down to one chemical.
Yeah.
But dopamine is a pretty powerful chemical. We talk about it as the pleasure chemical, we talk about it as a reward chemical, and it is that. But I think what's been really fascinating about it is that we're learning it's actually a learning chemical. It's there to work with rewards and motivation to basically get you the experience you need. If we go back to that one little thing the brain does, it's the prediction machine, right? To get you the experience you need so your brain can predict things better.
Yes.
And one of the ways it does that is by giving you pleasure, by giving you rewards, because obviously these things we need, we have a profound biological need for food, for water, for sex, and also for companionship. And so dopamine gets lets loose in the brain to tell you, okay, that's good stuff. You want to get more of that if you can get that. We need to be making babies and eating and propagating the species here. But it's also really working to help you learn what to do, what not to do, how to survive, how to thrive, and how to build skills. So it's really is a powerful chemical that goes much beyond love, and certainly much beyond addiction and just reward deficiencies.
Well, beyond that satisfaction principle, did you form any conclusions about how couples can stay together more effectively? What is the bonding element that keeps them together for a lifetime?
It seems that in a lot of the research, what you find, it's people that genuinely kind of enjoy each other. Instead of just assuming, okay, this is a marriage, it's meant to last, I'm here, I'm gonna slog through. It's people that consistently find novel ways to enjoy each other's company. And what's funny, so much, you read women's magazines and 5 hints to make him stay and whatnot. But one thing that kept kind of coming up was like novelty and date nights. Instead of just spending every Thursday night going to a movie into the same Italian restaurant you've been going to for the last 10 years. And don't get me wrong, I understand that impulse because my favorite Italian restaurant has great spaghetti. But it's trying new things together. It's finding new ways to communicate and enjoy each other. So one week you take the tango lessons that you want to take. The next week, okay, he wants to try paintballing. All right, but you better buy me a big martini afterward. Just finding ways to respect each other, enjoy each other, and funny new things to talk about besides the kids and work and whatever else. And a lot of those novel experiences, it does feed into that dopamine circuit. It does release that glut of chemicals that helps, make those bonds stay. So, of course, that's one thing. There are probably 100 different things that make the difference between why one couple makes it and another doesn't. But I don't think you can go wrong with trying new things together and finding new ways to enjoy each other's company.
I like that. To say it in a more fundamental way, based on what we've been talking about during this half hour, it's really facing different realities together. So
Yeah.
when you say different things, I think if you really bring it down to reality, there's a different world context that two people are experiencing together. And then, of course, they may experience it in different ways, but they can then process it as a team regarding what they thought about it, where they're going to go next. And they've actually experienced it together, so they actually have an opportunity to bond a bit more in that different context.
I think it also comes down to appreciating that your partner has a different view. I think, there's a lot to be said for approaching life as a team, right? But when you think, so often we get stuck in our own heads. And so we think the team is all about our goals and our likes and, what we're going for. And so I think sometimes when you try those new experiences, you get to see the world through your partner's eyes in a different way. And so you realize that the team isn't just about, your thoughts and your directions. It's also theirs as well. And so this is my second marriage. It's only been 3 years, so I'm sure you could still say we're in the honeymoon phase. But in terms of appreciating each other, trying new things, it really has made a difference. And, with my first marriage, I knew it was circling the drain well at the 3-year mark, because we weren't able to sort of, find those different ways to connect and these different ways to appreciate each other.
Yeah, that metaphor of circling the drain, I've got it. We've seen that happen a few times. Well, listen, where can people get a hold of you, Kayt, if they wanted to connect with you further? If you could give us that, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. You can find me on my website at www.kaytsukel.com. That's KaytSukel.com. I'm on Twitter as @Kayt Sukel, KaytSukel. And of course, you can pick up a copy of The Art of Risk or This Is Your Brain on Sex. They're available wherever books are sold. And I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you so much. We're going to have, in addition, a book giveaway. I really didn't mention it till just now, but one of the things we're going to do and it'll be at this download link, The Art of Risk, The New Science of Courage, Caution, and Chance. Kayt's going to provide that book as a giveaway, and it's going to be at corebrainjournal.com/027download. 027 download. And if you drop it in there, it's only going to be up for a certain period of time. I think we're leaving the opportunity up for about 2 weeks, something like that, to let's make it happen so we can move forward. And so I want to thank you very much, Kayt, for coming on board. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I'm really looking forward. I didn't read the book. I'm looking forward to reading the book because what you're talking about, I think, is so elementally useful in everyday life if we take a little deeper look at it.
Well, I appreciate you having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.